Welcome. I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, Thus Says the Lord, God Speaks Through His Servants the Prophets. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 10 of our study, which covers selections from the book of the Prophet Ezra and the book of Haggai. So here we are on Lesson 10, which is well over a third of the way through this Bible study. Since we began, we have been heavily anticipating this idea that the people were going to return from exile, and that a lot of the activity in this study happens after that, and it's taken us till now to get there. And we've got, coming up now, a series of lessons where we track through this return. Interesting and important historical note that we'll see here, doesn't happen all at once. So if you're not reading the text super closely, it can kind of sound like everybody just goes back. There are a number of waves under a number of different kings. In this setup, we see two of those. We see Cyrus and we see Darius. And we'll see a third further along when the so-named Ezra appears in his own book and in his own lesson, which is yet to come. For the sake of this lesson, we are talking about the first wave of this return. So the important historical point here that is worth getting into is the people are released from exile in Babylon. What has been Babylon, and is now Persia. So lots of, through the early part, mid part of the Old Testament history, there's a lot of stability, right? There's one kingdom and then two kingdoms and a lot of neighbors, and everybody is kind of more or less stable-ish. And there are a lot of small kingdoms doing a lot of different things. We have entered a period of world history where that's not the case. Now we're going to see bigger and bigger powers consolidate more and more of these kingdoms, from Babylon to Persia to Greece to Rome. And it's going to be significant, and with that will come a lot of changes as the God's people are going to be confronted with a lack of autonomy. So they're going to return, but there is no real possibility. I guess with God all things are possible, but there's no reasonable possibility that they're ever going to be autonomous and running their own kingdom and dominating regional politics the way they once did with David and Solomon. And so that is just the reality of the situation, which creates a fair amount of tension among some of these people who would like things to go back to the way that they were. And that trend continues through the time of Jesus. But there's also, so there's a bit of an identity shift, and more than a bit of an identity shift. There's a huge identity shift, not only around the fact that we're not in charge geopolitically of the way we were, and power-wise of the way we were before, but now also we have this whole fascinating trend of religious practice that emerged in exile, when they did not have access to the temple and the means of their old practice. Something new emerged that was a lot more focused on the study of the law and not exclusively concerned with the priesthood and the old rites, which we'll get to when we get to Ezra, who really ushers in a significant religious change. For today, what we see is, as people return to the land, they're trying to return to the old identity. And we're going to see how that doesn't work. But there are important parts of it that also have to be preserved and restored. And it really is an identity crisis for these people who have been in exile for a generation and are returning, and who have in their minds and in their past, this idea that things should be like they were, and they can't. And we have not yet figured out how they should be. So that is kind of the tension here and the journey of this book. And God sends prophets to help them adjust and to guide them through that transition. And as opposed to previously, we will see that they are notably more receptive now to God helping shape their identity, which is a positive fruit of that exile. And a thing we can all think about, bad things happen in our lives. It's very easy to dwell on, that was bad and I don't like it. Sometimes very good things come out of the bad things that happen in our lives. For these people, we'll see a lot of very positive things come out of this period of exile. The other thing worth commenting on in some depth, well, there are two. Before we get into kind of the typology and some of what's going on, which is great, for the sake of completeness of the question here, so Cyrus and Darius and what's going on. First wave of return, we see there is, and this is useful to keep in mind for later in this lesson, what is the stated purpose for which Cyrus lets people go back? It is to build a house for God. Then we cut to Darius, the next king, and enough time we see has passed that the original proclamation and return has been forgotten about. And it comes back up with a new king who starts talking about it again. And guess what still hasn't happened back at home and is still a relevant thing? The people who are allowed to go home and given a bunch of money to rebuild a house for God, because Cyrus decided that was the thing to do, haven't done it yet. So that is some of what we confront and kind of the major theme here of the book of the prophet that we'll be looking primarily at today. So that's where we see, again, waves, and different people go in different waves, which we'll focus more on when we get to Ezra. But it's fair to say for now, these are more of the working classes and more of the upper classes who have a very comfortable and cushy life in Persia, are less inclined to lead the way toward going to the ruin that is Jerusalem and, being involved in the manual work of literally rebuilding the city. They kind of chill and hang back with the full intention of going, but other people can do the rebuilding and then they'll return later, which is just the way the world works. And we'll see they bring great things with them when they come, and it works out very well. So I'm not trying to disparage that reality, but that explains a large part of why this happens in waves, right? It is unfortunately the way the world works that there are people that are happy to return but don't necessarily want themselves to be physically rebuilding. So at any rate, this first wave is less composed of those middle and upper classes, and is going to be a lot more involved with lower classes. First and second with Darius as well, but where we're at with this book, a lot of the more educated people have not yet returned, which is very notable. Finally, there is a fascinating comparison here that is worth looking at. This is the second time in the history of these people that they have been in a period of captivity and they have been let go in some capacity. This one is very, very different from the first one. The first one obviously being Pharaoh of Egypt, and Moses, let my people go, even though Aaron would have been the one saying that, but it's really dramatic to have Moses saying it in a movie. But the whole deal of Pharaoh, you need to let our people go, and Pharaoh saying, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. And a series of plagues around that, and then Pharaoh finally relents and then immediately again changes his mind and says, yeah, no, actually I'm going to chase after you because I don't want you to go. Or to take all your stuff with you, which I think should be mine. And the labor you're offering. In general, I want you here still, because having a lot of slaves is nice, and it's helpful for Egypt. So there's a series of plagues, and throughout that ordeal, we see that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, which is a fascinating concept in and of itself. We are creating a study for the not terribly distant future in Exodus. We'll dwell a lot more on some of those themes when we're actually talking about Exodus. But for this purpose, God also acts on Cyrus, right? We see that the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, and instead of hardening his heart, Cyrus thinks, I'm going to let you go back and you should build a house for God. The other fascinating comparison and lineage that puts Cyrus in, with specifically what he feels called to do, is David and Solomon. The promise was made, David, you'll build a house for God, and then Solomon boldly claimed that, well, I am really my father's true destiny and rightful king of the people. Look, I'm going to build a house for God, like he said that was going to happen and I was going to do. And arguably was not really Solomon's job to, not even arguably, was not really Solomon's job to do. But it happened. And there was all that idea of the legitimate king of Judah being the one involved in constructing this temple. And now the king of Persia is the one that God is saying, you should let these people go and build this house. So in some ways, it's really hard to argue that doesn't kind of largely ratify Cyrus as the king that God has chosen to act as king of these people. God is okay with foreign oppressors, with foreign rulers of his people. Because again, he is their king, right? God never loved the idea of them having a king, a political king to begin with. And that's not an institution, clearly, that God is incredibly attached to. But again, and this builds on one of my favorite themes in the Old Testament, there are these instances where when you have things happen in two waves or two passes, the second one, the first tends to be violent and the second non-violent, like the workings of the prophet Elijah and then the immediate following of the workings of the prophet Elisha. Most of Elijah's miracles involve violence and death. And most of Elisha's, other than that thing with the bears, involve the opposite, or non-violent. Elijah gets surrounded by people who are against him, and a whole lot of fire rains from heaven and kill them. Elisha gets surrounded by people who are against him, and a fog comes, and he's able to pass through them without being harmed or harming. Which is a greater and a more powerful working of God, to deliver by his mighty hand through mass murder his people out of the clutches of Egypt who wanted to keep them, or him persuading a nation that benefits from keeping them enslaved, financially and materially, him acting and getting them to freely say, I'm just going to let them go. And I'm going to give them a bunch of money and goods to help them do that. We're so biased toward violence, I think sometimes we see the former as more powerful than the second. But if you think about what it takes to achieve that, I would argue that this is actually a greater work of God than the former. And that is very important because, again, what we're functionally doing is God built a nation, he pulled his people out of slavery to set them up and establish a nation. There was a lot wrong with that. We went back into slavery so we can come back and start over in building a nation. We're starting on a different foundation this time. We're starting on a foundation of peace and a different manifestation of God's power and a different dynamic for how we interact with our neighbors. We're also not going into the Holy Land swords in hand, kicking out the people who were there also through violence. We're going back, it's a grant from a benevolent ruler who controls the region. There will be a little bit of struggle, but nothing like there was before. The land is given to the people by right, great from God, but also from Persia, who has say over the region. So there's no need to fight to take control either. So what was originally done with violence and the sword, here is done basically with a pen and at the decree of Cyrus, king of Persia, which is a fascinating change. And is, again, incredibly important to what we're trying to do here. We saw that the first pass didn't work, right? So many things about it went wrong. Here we're going to try a different way. And that will be fascinating to see develop, and we will work on that as we go. But by and large, at any rate, that is what is going on here in the world at the time of this particular prophet's working. And for the rest of the lesson, we can explore the prophet Haggai. So we have set the historical context thanks to some help from the book of the prophet Ezra. Now, as we start the book of Haggai, we're reminding ourselves of that context, and we're shifting kind of focus from Babylon, Persia, back to Jerusalem. So there we see we're in the reign of Darius. So again, the people have come back already after Cyrus allowing them to return. And we're going to see pretty quickly what they have not done and what they have done. Who does this prophet speak to? Again, we see some of the old infrastructure. We've got the important figures are going to be the high priest and the governor, who is, for functional purposes, we're basically trying to go back to having a king and a high priest as a king figure, and the high priest as the people in charge. So we talked about the identity crisis we're going to go through here for a little while. The people come back. They're generally trying to return to the power structures that they had before. We're going to see how that goes, but for now, that is the point where it's bearing in mind. Now God weighs in through a prophet. So again, Cyrus sent the people back with a very particular commission to build a house for God. They've been around for a while. They have opted to ignore that particular idea and have, as we see, focused much more on their comfort than on worrying about that. So God comes in and says, you know, guys, you've had a lot of time to do this on your own. It looks like it's not a priority. Maybe it should be a priority. I think you should do that. By the way, have you wondered why so many of your efforts and your works are not flourishing and prospering upon your return? Maybe it's because when you focus on yourself first and don't carve out and make that space and time for God, everything else kind of languishes at best. Important takeaway here, right? What does it mean for something to be holy? It is for it to be set apart. These people are returning and they're not consecrating, sanctifying, setting apart anything. They're trying to be like everyone else. In their defense, a large part of that is because a whole lot of the class that would have been more involved in the priests and the scribes, that would have been more involved in suggesting that they do otherwise aren't there yet. So, I mean, these are laborers and farmers and the like, and it makes a lot of sense. It really does, to want to make sure everything is stable before, and your needs are met before you worry about other things. The primary, I think, concern and criticism here is God a need or a want in our lives and our worship of God? They're treating it like a secondary priority. I don't think that it's unimportant to them. They're just not placing it on the level of their key needs. Which is a challenge we all face and have to work with in our lives, is where do we put that? But putting our worship of God as the first thing in our lives is by definition the thing that creates that setting apart and that sanctifying. Until you do that, you don't have the foundations of holiness in your life. And because they haven't done that, God doesn't care so much about the physical manifestation of the temple, right? It's just that right now, that is what they know and how they know to worship God. And when they're not doing that, they don't currently have the means of worshiping God. So they don't have that ability. It is functionally impossible for this people to be holy upon their return until they carve out and set God and the things of God first, which they're not doing. So I think it's the building of the temple is ultimately less important than the act of building the temple, but as we will see, it is for what's coming next to come next. We do have to have that infrastructure. It turns out the governor, high priest running things, part of the infrastructure, we don't want that. We don't need that. That's going away quickly. But the sacrifice, temple, offering to God, worship, priesthood, part of that infrastructure we need. It's not going to be all there is anymore. We're going to build on and change that too. But the core of what that is, God set up way back with Moses and means to build on, right? We need, even into Jesus Christ and beyond, we need that core infrastructure, that idea that we sin against God and there is a means that he has set up for fixing that wrong that has been committed, for righting that wrong. And we have to then, there is just the one means, right? If you sin, you die, and a death is owed to God to right that wrong that has been done. The core function of the priesthood and the temple is to pay that debt and to thereby assuage God's anger. The reason we don't need a temple now, and all of the function of that has changed with Jesus Christ, is because we had one sacrifice that superabounds, that is more than sufficient for the paying of debt, all debt. The details of how that works are fascinating, but longer than we'll get into here. Check out our Hebrew study if you want to go into great detail there, and also see fascinating developments about the priesthood that'll go beyond where we go in the scope of this study. It's great, but for now, we still use that core infrastructure. The reason we don't have to have a single temple is because we're not offering we're not actually committing the killing act of the sacrifice, although we are participating in its fruit and remembering in a way that makes present an act that occurred in the past. And we still use an altar. We still keep dressings of the temple, and we keep much of the liturgy around that, because that core idea that we have sinned and debt has occurred that requires death because there has been sin, and that death has to occur to right that, is still true. That has not changed, and it's I think, too easy for us as Christians to get away from that idea and think that Christianity is about being nice to people. Jesus was not certainly always nice. That's not really what it's about. But it is, well, we'll get to the Christian side of this, right? In the study, it's too complicated, too big of a topic to go into on this video here. But suffice it to say, it is critically important to maintain this infrastructure of how do we right our relationship with God when it is wronged. How do we pay the debt that is owed? We cannot possibly seek to be serving and loving God when we don't have in place a means of righting the wrongs that have been committed and restoring our relationship with God. So, for example, modern day, if you're not fairly regularly going to confession, you're probably not carrying out and realizing the infrastructure involved with really building a meaningful relationship with God. Basically, what these people have done is they've returned from being in exile because they really, really angered God, and they have decided that they functionally didn't need to go to confession for a generation. And it was not important, even though they were just in exile for angering God repeatedly, they get back and they still have not set up the thing that they need to have to right that wrong with God. They're treating it like, oh, he let us back, so all must be forgiven. You still have to make atonement. You still have to pay your debt. He let you back. The temple should have, again, need versus want, right? There should be an overwhelming sense of spiritual need here that we owe this debt to God. He let us come back. All the more reason that we should be paying it immediately. And instead, they're worried about what they're eating, which again, where they're sleeping. And again, have kind of built fairly nice houses for themselves. At least decent enough that God can say, you've had the leisure to do this and you haven't worried about rebuilding the temple. Hey guys, priorities. So, again, a lot of things there, general idea. For us to take away is holiness comes when God is the first thing in our lives. And when we make sure that we are regularly doing what it takes to right any wrongs that may come up in our relationship with God. That was critical back then. It's critical today. Here we build on the point with one key addition that I didn't make in the last question because God hadn't said it yet, which is not only does the temple provide the infrastructure needed to offer sacrifice, but it also provides the infrastructure needed for God to be present among his people. He's saying, I can't live with you and be among you until you have this done. Again, so much in these people's history and religious tradition is about sacred spaces and how to sanctify a space and how doing so sanctifies the spaces around it. You have the layers of what was in the tabernacle, the original tent, and the different layers, and then they carried that idea over to the temple, and the kind of idea is having God in the center progressively sanctifies everything around it. In different levels and layers. So it would sanctify obviously where God is in that inner holy well, the ark originally where he actually was, and then the Holy of Holies where the ark was and everything was coated in gold, and then the curtained-in temple area where the priests could still go and practice more routinely, and then the courtyard where the people could, if they met the right circumstances, occasionally come, and then wherever that was set up, kind of the whole encampment, or where the people lived, were sanctified by having it there. And the idea is really, you've got God living in the temple, sanctifying primarily the temple for non-stop worship of God. The outer area of the temple where more people can come sanctifies the whole city of Jerusalem around it and ultimately the entire nation, right? And it spread, that sanctity spreads from the act of setting apart and sanctifying this holy place in the middle of it. and God living there. And God's presence there is then sufficient to spread out and to sanctify the entire area. Again, something that still occurs today. God is physically present in Catholic churches. You have first and most sacred this piece of bread that contains and is the presence of God. And then you have the container in which it is kept, the most sacred thing in a church. And then that is kept in a tabernacle, very often in a chapel or up on the altar or in a set-apart area that is still the most sacred part of your church, right? And then from there, obviously that sanctifies the entire church, and that sanctifies, right? It's still a thing that occurs now. And it's still the presence of God progressively and by degrees sanctifies everything around it. And that occurs by not only God being there, but by how we respond to that. And our designating and setting apart that area serves, and we don't make God holier by our setting apart of those things. We make ourselves holier by doing so. It is a necessary, again, thing for us to do. The act of setting apart or consecrating things, as it turns out, consecrates ourselves. Because we have to act differently to do so. We are creating something that is set apart in the world and that is set apart within ourselves. And in so doing, we create holiness. So again, very important ritually. And you can't do that when you don't have a temple. So God wants to live with his people, and that is, again, an essential thing for the holiness or sanctity of the people. And then something unusual occurs. And this is where we begin to see a difference from how things were before. It was looking very much like we were moving forward with business as usual. And then a prophet spoke to the people, and they listened. We have seen hundreds of years now of the contrary, of almost universally the people ignoring the strong advice of signs, teachings of the prophets. We have not seen really anything by way of positive reception. And now, not only does the prophet doesn't have to repeat himself. It's not like for 10 years he begged them as the crops remained, as the skies remained dry and the crops weren't growing, until finally the people relented and begrudgingly did what God asked for about a year and a half, and then went back to business as usual. It is, God spoke to the people through the prophet. He moved the spirits of the leaders and of all the people, and everybody said, oh yeah, we get it, we'll do that now. That is a great shift, right? It cannot be overstated. That's the key thing that's different here, is after their time in exile, they have learned and they have grown. And now they are interested in pleasing God. We'll continue to see how far away they were from carrying out their obligations toward God before. It's worse than it kind of seemed as we were reading it, as it turns out. We'll get to that. But now the hearts of the people and their leaders seem to have changed in exile, which will make all of the difference. And for us, there's something there as well, right? How often do we follow God reluctantly, if at all, or are we eager to listen to and to follow and to please God with our lives? Too often, I know I fall into the category of grudgingly at best, doing some of the things that I think God is asking me to do with my life. And it's far too rare that I'm eager to seek out to find God's will and to act on it in my life. It's a thing worth reflecting on, I think, probably for all of us. And this is the attitude of these people here that we are asked to have. So they get a little bit of, we can throw a little bit of shade on them for, you've been back here this long and you haven't prioritized building the temple. Great, but as soon as someone says, oh, you should have behaved differently, they say, oh, yep, okay, you're right. Mea culpa, we'll get right on that. Not at all a bad disposition toward God. So they got off to a wee bit of a rocky start, but we're getting right back on track, which is what we really would like a prophet to be able to do, right? We've talked so much about a prophet as a corrective to the king of your leaders are just going to be bad, and so you need prophets to come in and at least have God's voice heard if you're going to adamantly insist on not following his will. And so that's sort of been what a prophet does since Elijah, because that's been the state of these two kingdoms. Now we get to see another side of it, where what happens to the people when they listen and obey. So we're going to try a different means of profiting here. The one where people listen, and the one where, as a result, the people move forward instead of staying stagnant. So that's going to be neat. And that's the fruit of exile for these people. Here we deal with, again, I think a very common human thing, and we see that God does not share what might be the human concern. What's the concern? So they're rebuilding the temple. If you remember how it was built originally, the people were very rich when they built it the first time, and they poured a lot of that wealth into the construction of the temple. It was, by all accounts, fantastic. They're not so rich now. They have nice sponsorship from Persia, which definitely helps, but by no means do they have the abundance of wealth that they had when they originally built it. It is not the same building. And there are clearly, someone would have to be very old at this point, but it's possible to have seen the old building. So, by and large, the comparison is not against, I've seen this and I've seen them both and I know how much better the other one is. More, the comparison is against an idea, right? We have this idea of this old temple as this perfect, glamorous place, and we have not built that, and we feel like we have failed in that regard. The key point, though, is the job of the temple isn't to look fancy. The job of the temple is, again, to be a set-apart sacred space that serves these liturgical purposes for the people. And they weren't using it for that, for basically the entire history of the nicer building. God was content to live in a tent. That was his idea. It was Solomon's, again, idea, trying to claim an authority that he probably didn't rightly have, to actually build the temple. If David had done it and used it, you could make a case that it had at one time been well used. By the time, as God would have desired. By the time it actually happened, the people were already straying from God. So this old temple was, in a very real sense, a symbol of the people's straying from the right path, and not this great holy thing that had been used for right worship of God for generations. So it's fascinating how those ideas work, that, oh, in our minds we associate this as such a great thing that we'll never be able to get back to, when it was not. It was never used correctly for its intended purpose. It doesn't matter how nice it looked. Who cares? God doesn't. God was fine with the tent. The shift that we have here is God is saying, don't worry about it. Here I want to live. There, I wasn't so crazy about. But I want to live with you and be here. This is more than sufficient for me. I'm fine, so this is great. Good job, guys. Sometimes I think we like nice stuff, so we assume God likes nice stuff. Why on earth would God care? Right? He controls literally everything. There is, what makes gold valuable is in part its scarcity, right? Well, that's not a thing for God, right? If he wants gold, there's gold. There is no relative value of one material over another in the eyes of God, because they're all equally plentiful. So even the psychological ideas going on that create value of some materials and some constructions versus others, that's not how the mind of God would work, because God does not deal with scarcity the way that we do. And so what difference is there of a temple made of gold or a temple made of not gold? The only thing that made the gold potentially valuable and interesting to God was the cost to us or to the people involved in what they gave to build it, because again, that sets it apart and gives it value. But he doesn't care about how much money it takes. He cares about the intention that goes into it. Same with our lives today. He doesn't care about having our nice stuff. He cares about having the attitude that puts him first and isn't stingy with God. And these people have met that. They have given to God what they have. He doesn't need them to give more than what they have. There's no benefit to anyone in that. So again, God is pleased, and that shows us a very important thing about God and is critical to the identity change of these people. You don't have to be the most powerful and the richest to be the most pleasing to God. In fact, those things may have been a problem and stood in the way of you being pleasing to God. When we start from humbler beginnings and we're not so worried about being in charge of everyone and having this great king and rich kingdom, maybe we'll actually be able to do better as the people of God. Building on the point, God doesn't need your money because he has all that he needs. And if you're in line with God, so too shall you. We saw, actually, very progressively, the fortunes of the people decline over time as they continued and obstinately did not follow God. Right? We had the brief and golden period where, very literally in fact, where everything flourished, primarily as a result of David. And then from there, pretty much progressively going downhill. Solomon also saw a period of prosperity. God explained, you've deserved to die, but for the sake of your father David, you're gonna be fine. But then it's gonna go to a bad place. So Solomon kind of got a pass, but even that was explicitly stated was because of David. And then we kind of moved downhill over time, pretty constantly, and at a fairly good rate. In terms of the prosperity and fortunes of the people. Obviously, immediately with the split, and there was never the same level of prosperity, but then both kingdoms, again, continued to more or less progressively decline. And the farther away from God, no one ever connecting that the farther away from God they got, the less they prospered. Here God makes the point very plainly. Don't worry about it. You will prosper again because you're acting like you're going to take this seriously this time. And if you do, you will thrive and you will prosper. Interestingly, this is a fascinating bit of prophecy here, because they don't ever ascend to that level of material wealth that they had before. So there's a sense in which this is wrong. There's a sense in which it is not wrong as well, right? I think money, in this sense, gold and silver, are being used as representations of value. Coming into the temple and God's people is something of great and surpassing value that will dwarf anything from the days of David and Solomon and before and after. And of course that comes with the coming of Jesus Christ, and something God gives and brings to his people: value, splendor, glory, prosperity, abundance, surpassing anything that they could have imagined. And it comes from their obedience that allows him to bring forth this new and great thing. So now you go into any temple, any church, Catholic church, and you find in it something of greater value than all of the money that can ever be accumulated. So what God promised has been achieved, but it was not achieved in this kingdom in these days in the way that it sounds like it's promising, which again is interesting, but certainly not a bad thing. It is what it is, and it's actually a very good thing. But again, prophecy has different manifestations. It is kind of interesting to see one that, at least in some capacity, doesn't work out, but in a very other capacity, certainly very much does. This is, to me, I think, the most interesting part of this book, although with the things we've already talked about, the key ideas should be there already in a way that probably get us to where we need to be to look at this. So we've talked some already about what sanctifies and what doesn't sanctify, about how to make a thing holy. This focuses on kind of the opposite idea. So interestingly, holiness is not contagious, right? Holiness, by definition, we have to set a thing apart, right? So by putting it over here and by setting it apart, it becomes holy. It's not holy by contact, right? By touching unholy things, you are mingling the set apart and the not set apart. What direction does that make the whole system go? Well, you've broken down the barrier that sets something apart. So you don't sanctify the things that come into contact with the holy. You corrupt and contaminate the holy, right? That's the core idea here being set aside as an example, is holiness only exists where the boundaries are respected and upheld. And so you, as a people who have not built this temple, who have not taken actions in your lives and your society to set God apart, cannot be holy because you have broken down the boundaries that allow for the existence of holiness. So there cannot be holy things because the lack of those boundaries corrupts everything. You can't kind of have a sacred thing, sort of, sometimes. If you don't hold and enforce the boundaries and separation, it is not holy. That's not just true back then. That is still very much how holiness works, right? With the exception of, we can't make God unholy, right? So we can try to come into contact with God, and we can try to bring a corrupted thing that is us into contact with God. We will not corrupt God himself, but that will also not make us holy, right? Us touching God when we're not set apart and coming into contact with God, even God cannot sanctify us if those boundaries are down. We just won't corrupt God. But if we want to be holy, as an individual, as a family, as a society, as a church, we have to have in our lives those boundaries, those things where God is set apart and sacred. And where those things don't exist, we can kid ourselves into thinking we are serving and worshiping God, but by definition, we cannot be holy. So an idea that I personally take very seriously here is the idea of a holy day or a Sabbath. I'm not telling anyone you have to follow this practice to be holy, right? The idea is you have to have things that are set apart for God. It's less clear that the very specifics of everyone has to do that the same way and it looks the same. I'm less convinced that's important than it is that we have those things that are set apart. For me personally, one of the ways I try to do it is to set apart the Sabbath day, Sundays, as a day where I don't engage in commerce. I definitely don't work. I try not to do much in the way of chores. It's more, admittedly, it tends to be more separated by what I'm not doing than by what I am doing, and I've got a lot of room for progress in terms of what I am doing, but it is still a thing where there are certain boundaries that I try to keep and to enforce to make this a sacred thing in a regard. Just an example, there are tons of ways we can in our lives carve out, create those boundaries, create sacred spaces in our lives. The key lesson here and the challenge is, can you name some examples of things where you have those boundaries, where there are things carved out or set apart in your life for God? If you can't, you don't have holiness in your life, period, by definition, which is kind of an alarming thing to think about, because again, I suspect many of us fall into the idea that, well, I go about my life, I don't do any harm to anyone, and I'm fairly nice from time to time, when I'm not in a really bad mood or something, is enough to be a good Catholic Christian. And it's just not. You're not set apart from the society in which you're living that way. You're not holy. Anyway, food for thought and potentially challenging for all of us if we think too hard about that idea. It's definitely not a comfortable idea. But I think even more because it's not, it is an important one. We are now winding back to a key theme. So we've built up to, and kind of indirectly, but very powerfully, developed this idea of holiness. We've developed it kind of broadly and abstractly, but we've also developed it in particular with the idea that for these people, the thing that God needs them to do to consecrate themselves is to build a temple. Now we're bringing it back to, why should you do this and what's in it for you? You have not been faring so favorably upon your return. When we try to keep things as they are, all for ourselves and all blurred together, we fare as humans do. When we take some of that, carve it out, and set it apart for God, what we think will happen is that we will have less, because we have removed some of what we have. Some of our time, our focus, our energy, our resources. We have taken some of the limited amount that we have, and we have made it God's. So what we logically, but incorrectly, think will happen is that by giving that part away, we will have less. Here, what God is reminding the people of is that that is not actually what occurs. And this is one of the repeated and almost infallible miracles of God, is that when we do set things aside for God, those things come back to us and then some. We do not, as it turns out, have less for what we give to God. But that flies in direct contradiction to human reason. And it makes it hard to, it is an act of faith, right, of trust in God, to give to Him not from your abundance, but from your lack of abundance, from your want, from your need. And when we do, it changes the nature of our relationship with God. And we prosper. Maybe not materially. I'm not promising, this is not a health and wealth gospel thing. I'm not promising you send your last $100 that you need to pay your rent to God and you'll get $10,000 back immediately, and just send the money in now and all of your financial woes will be eliminated, right? There are people who do that. That is not the Catholic position. Again, we see the abundance that ultimately comes to these people is not material. That can be true for us as well. So I am not promising that you will thrive materially when you set apart material possessions for God. I am saying that you will receive back more than what you give, as will these people. Here again we see an interesting thing. And a prophecy that both is and is not true. Very true, God is shaking things up in the world. We'll get to that as we keep progressing through the geopolitical situation here, and I've commented a little bit on it also already. But it turns out that Persia is not the leading power in the world forever, and that who's in charge of this region will go through some changes and some upheaval and some turmoil. So that part very much accurate. There's going to be a lot of turmoil. Less clear is the idea that Zerubbabel becomes the guy. He doesn't, and we'll see that fairly shortly. So what on earth does that mean if it doesn't mean that Zerubbabel, the governor in the region, is going to become the guy and we're going to become our own power here again, and we'll go back to being like David was. And that is kind of an interesting point because it's hard to see Zerubbabel, the governor, as a type of Christ. We don't know that much about it, right? And that's the ultimate thing that happens where God arrests power away from the world and places it in a new person and in a new institution. You, as a governor and not a king, you could almost see Zerubbabel almost as more of a foreshadowing of someone like Peter. But less clear. But the idea of there's going to be some person that is in control of God's kingdom in a steward or a gubernatorial sort of role. Gubernatorial is the word I was looking for there. Not an easy one to get out when you're not prepared to say that word necessarily. It's an interesting thing to think about. Personally, I do think it foreshadows the idea of church, right? We've got Jesus as remote king, and we've got kind of us running by institution that with the power of and authority of Jesus extended to us, running that institution locally. It's Jesus' power that's doing it, and it's basically some no-name in comparison who ends up doing the work here on earth. And that is kind of the significance of Zerubbabel, is he doesn't have any. And that is kind of the relationship between us and our church and God, whose ultimate kingdom it really is. And I think that makes sense. You can take it or leave it, but that's how I have made sense of this prophecy for myself. So we don't claim to necessarily be able to we definitely don't claim at all to be able to fully explain all of these prophecies that we're looking at. What I will say is we're not wanting to approach this with the idea of, we know this one doesn't come true, so it's wrong, right? That's not how we want to approach prophecy. It's in the Bible, it's there for a reason. We should give it the benefit of the doubt that there is some manifestation and interpretation of this prophecy that is true, even if what it seems to be saying is not. And we've seen this book misses on a few key points in terms of what is immediately going to happen, whereas some of these eerily seem to be able to have written down the future before it happened. Some of them seem to have whiffed a little bit on the future, but have still gotten to very important ideas about, more broadly speaking, where God is going. And I think Haggai has more of those. So, anyway, whole lot here about holiness and what makes a person and a people holy. And our big takeaways should be focused on that and what we can thereby also do to sanctify ourselves and our world. This has been an overview of Lesson 10 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants, the prophets. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.